Hey geometry team, and welcome to Unit 7 Day 2. We're ready to learn about more special properties of parallelograms other than just what makes them the different parallelograms. So if you're ready, I'm ready. Let's move on. To start us off, we have just your basic parallelogram. If you recall, a parallelogram is just a quadrilateral, a four-sided shape that happens to have two of its opposite sides are parallel. So that means that this top and this bottom side are going to be parallel, and these side ones will also be parallel. That's what makes it a parallelogram. So we have that. Well, what are some other special things that every parallelogram in the entire universe has? Well, to start, since those opposite sides are parallel, we know that the opposite sides are going to be congruent, which is something that you've, known all along, you've seen and heard and done. And so that's going to give you that this side and this side are congruent, and this one and this one are also congruent, which most of you already know. It was not part of the definition of a parallelogram, but it is an intrinsic property. Every parallelogram has parallel sides as well as congruent opposite sides. And then the third thing that popped up, because I can't control my mouse, is that the opposite angles are also congruent. And this may have been something that you already had figured out on your own as well. This angle B up here in this corner is always going to be the same as the one directly opposite to it. They are the same size, which gives you also that this angle C and this angle A, this whole big angle here, is also congruent to each other. Okay, so we've got this pair is congruent and this pair is congruent, always and every time. Whether you squish this down flatter or stand it up straighter, that is always going to be the case. Our fourth property of every parallelogram in the universe, if I can get my guy to move on to the next one. Come on, buddy, you can do it. Oh, the joy of using computers. Click. There it is. So the adjacent angles now are going to be supplementary. Now that one's a little bit different looking to you, but what that means is that these two angles right here on this side will always be supplementary. They're always going to add up to 180 degrees. Well, so are these two going to add up to 180 degrees. And so are these ones. And so are these ones. And the reason that works is since these two are congruent and these two are congruent, once you say that these two are supplementary, you can swap out the B for the D, and now these two are supplementary. And then if C and A are congruent, and now these two are supplementary. And so another property, so you know that if we tell you it's a property, we're probably going to have you use it in a problem where you have to be able to show how big an angle or something is by remembering that these adjacent angles are going to be supplementary. The opposite ones are congruent, the adjacent ones are supplementary. And so now that we've learned these basics of our parallelogram properties, I think it's time for us to go to the kitchen. And so the properties of all our special parallelograms are a lot like pancakes. Depending on what special thing you do to it, it's going to have special properties. And so parallelograms are just like a plain old stack of pancakes. You know what comes with that. You know it comes with your four congruent parallel sides, your opposite parallel congruent sides, your opposite congruent angles, and your adjacent supplementary angles. Every set of parallelograms is going to come with that. Well, if you add more special things, more special stuff is going to happen. So if you have rectangles are like a stack of pancakes that have butter and syrup on them. They're still a stack of pancakes. It still has all those original properties, but now we're going to add special things onto it. A rhombus is like a stack of pancakes that's got strawberries, bananas, and whipped cream on it. It's got all sorts of fancy stuff on it that makes it really good. But underneath it all, it's still a parallelogram with those 5 basic properties. And a square is like all of these things put together. It's got everything on it. It's got the butter and syrup, it's got the strawberries and whipped cream, but underneath it all, it's still a stack of pancakes. So a square is going to be a parallelogram. It's got all those 5 properties, plus whatever we come up with for rectangles, whatever we come up with for rhombuses, will all be included in your square. So your square is going to be your little bit of everything. It's super special. So a reminder of all your parallelogram properties. That's your plain old stack. Everything is always included. We come to rectangles now, and rectangles have all those 5 properties plus some additional properties. So we are still parallel on our opposite sides. We still have congruent opposites, but we also have congruent adjacent angles now, because a rectangle, of course, is a right-angled parallelogram. So all 4 of these are right angles. And because of our property from parallelograms that said adjacent angles had to be supplementary, that's why if one is right, all 4 of them have to be right angles. So a rectangle is your parallelogram with extra stuff on top. And additionally, it also has, come here, button. You know, you would think I could just set this down somewhere and then it would work, but no, that would be too easy. Oh, now it went back too far. See, come here. There we go. So since all of these angles and opposite sides are congruent now we can say that the diagonals are also going to be congruent. Now you could prove this using side, super easy. This triangle here and this triangle here both have these 2 sides and this right angle here, so these hypotenuses have to be congruent. So your rectangles are going to be a parallelogram with 4 right angles and congruent diagonals. That's what makes rectangles special. Going forward now, let's go into the recipe for our rhombuses. Now rhombuses are still your stack of pancakes. They're still a parallelogram at heart. They are still parallel on their opposite sides. And all those things that we talked about for parallelograms. But now, if you recall, the definition of a rhombus tells us that it has 4 congruent sides. So the consecutive sides are always congruent. All 4 of them are. Okay? Because of this, this does some special stuff to the interior. Now, we have our diagonals, but you notice that they are not necessarily congruent. We have this longer one and we have this shorter one. So it doesn't have that property like a rectangle does. Instead, it has its own special properties. Its first special one, come on, buddy. I have to try and talk nice to wake it up. So the diagonals, instead of being congruent in a rhombus, they bisect the angles that they go through in the corners. So this vertex has been bisected by the diagonal. That means it creates 2 congruent angles here, which again, you could prove using all those triangle properties that we taught last semester, but I'll save you the hassle of doing that. And you can just trust me and learn that this diagonal will cut this angle in half. And up here, this diagonal will cut this angle in half. It will bisect it. And since these 2 are congruent, this one will also be bisected the same way. And then this one in this upper corner is also bisected by that diagonal. So the diagonals are doing some bisecting. Good times are happening. But for another really good time, the diagonals also are perpendicular to each other. Make sure you can see that down there at the bottom of the screen. They're perpendicular. So the diagonals of a rhombus are always going to make right angles here, which again, you can prove using the properties we've already had. But for now, you just need to know that if you have a rhombus, these diagonals will make right angles. So that's what makes the rhombus special. It's just like having all these strawberries and bananas and whipped cream on your regular stack. We have added all these properties just by making the 4 sides congruent. So anytime you have congruent sides, you're going to be bisecting these angles, making congruent angles, and you're going to be making perpendicular diagonals. I can remember my words, I promise. Okay, then our last one is the square. And if you remember for a square, Squares are a combination of both rhombuses and rectangles. And so they are like a stack of pancakes that has everything on it. They got the syrup, they got the bananas and strawberries and the whipped cream and the whole 9 yards. So this square is going to have your parallelogram properties. It's going to have parallel sides. It's going to have opposite sides congruent, all those things. But now it also has all those properties from rectangles. So it has the right angles. And it has your properties from your rhombus. It has 4 congruent sides. Well, all those other little properties are also going to apply here. And so now we're also going to have that these vertex angles are always going to be bisected. So they're always going to be 45 degrees, no matter what, because we've combined the fact that they're right with the fact that they were bisected. We are also going to have perpendicular diagonals, because since the sides were congruent, since it's technically a rhombus, these are going to be perpendicular. But wait, there's more. It's also a rectangle, which means these diagonals aren't just perpendicular to each other, they also bisect each other. And since they're the same length, because they're rectangles, since the diagonals are the same length, and since they bisect each other, we also have that all 4 of those diagonals are bisected to be the same size. So we've got lots of properties going on here. I recommend that you learn each individual shape's properties. So learn the rectangle, learn the square, learn the parallelogram, and learn the rhombus. Here is a visual to show you all those properties kind of all in one place. So you can see the 5 properties of our regular parallelogram. Every single one of these shapes has all 5 of these properties. As you go down, you add them on. So for your rhombus, you're adding on to these that now all the sides are congruent, the diagonals bisect all the corners, and the diagonals are perpendicular to each other. In your rectangle, we still have all 5 of these properties, plus the angles are right because it's a rectangle, and then the diagonals will be the same size because we've taken this parallelogram and pushed it up to stand up straight. So now this longer diagonal is going to shrink down to match the other one. So the 2 of them match. It's just like on an envelope. For those of you who've ever actually seen an old style envelope and used snail mail. And then your square is a combination of all of these. So it's got all 5 of these properties. It's got all of these properties from these guys all smashed down into one little guy. And so we've got all the sides being congruent and bisected and perpendicular and everything all thrown into one. So that's your parallelogram properties. Good luck, and we'll see you next time.